Welcome! Today, we're going to look at history from a totally different angle. Not from the perspective of generals or presidents, but through the eyes of the ordinary people who actually lived it. We're diving into how personal diaries can give us this incredible window into huge crises in a way you just can't get from a textbook. Our source for this explainer kicks off with this line, and it's a pretty stark truth, isn't it? We hear the statistics, we see the headlines, but the numbers can be so huge, so overwhelming, that it's actually kind of hard to wrap your head around the real, human cost of it all. So, that's really the big question we're tackling today. How do we get past the big abstract numbers and connect with what it actually felt like to be there? Well, as we're about to see, the answer's often found in the most personal records imaginable. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about why personal stories are just so powerful. Then, we're going to zoom in on two amazing accounts. One from the Siege of Leningrad during World War II, and another from the Great Plague of London. And finally, we'll tie it all together to see why these voices from the past are so important. You've probably heard of the Diary of Anne Frank, right? Well, that's a perfect example of what we're talking about. Her diary doesn't just tell us what happened, it tells us what it felt like to be there. These aren't just historical documents, they're human documents. Exactly. These personal records, they fill in all the little gaps that the big official histories leave out. They give us the texture of everyday life, the quiet moments of fear, a tiny spark of hope, the day-to-day grind that just never makes it into the headlines. All right, let's dive into our first story. We're heading to Leningrad, what's now St. Petersburg, during World War II. We're going to hear from a teenage girl, Lena Mukina, who kept a diary during one of the longest, most brutal sieges in all of human history. First, just let that number sink in. 872 days. That's nearly 2.5 years where the entire city was completely cut off under constant attack. It's almost impossible to imagine what that must have been like. And if that last number was hard to grasp, this one makes it all too real. 125 grams of bread. That's like a couple of thin slices. For an entire day. This wasn't just a war of bombs and bullets. It was a daily battle against starvation. Lena's diary lays out this relentless reality. There were bombings every single day, forcing people into shelters for hours on end. And she wrote about how, after a while, the constant fear just faded away, replaced by this numb apathy because of the appalling hunger and cold. Now this is one of those details that just stops you in your tracks. Think about it. A beautiful, clear, sunny day, or a bright moonlit night, things we love, became terrifying. Why? Because that's when the bombers could see their targets best. It was a complete reversal of normal life. Okay, so now we're going to jump way, way back in time, almost 300 years, to a totally different kind of crisis, an invisible one. We're in London in the 1660s, looking at Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. Here, the enemy wasn't bombs from the sky, but a silent, creeping sickness. You have to remember, this was a totally different world. No 24-hour news cycle, no internet, not even printed newspapers. Defoe explains that news of the plague just trickled in. It came through letters from merchants overseas and then spread from person to person. Can you imagine the uncertainty? And you can just feel the slow burn anxiety build up. It starts as a distant problem, way over in Holland. Then rumors start to hit London. They fade away for a bit because the government is quiet. And then, boom, the first official deaths are confirmed. The dread must have been palpable. And what's wild is the formal, almost bureaucratic process Defoe describes. It wasn't just panicked gossip. A rumor would start, and then the state would actually send in doctors to investigate the body. If they found signs of the plague, it was officially recorded for everyone to see. It was this slow, methodical, and absolutely terrifying way of confirming the worst. So we've looked at two totally different crises, right? A military siege and a deadly plague, separated by centuries. But let's pull back for a second and see what they tell us together about the human experience of a crisis. When you put them side by side like this, you start to see these universal fears pop up. In Leningrad, it was a visible enemy from above and the absolute certainty of hunger. In London, it was an invisible enemy you couldn't see and the total uncertainty of who or what to believe. But in both, you see this complete loss of normalcy. And that's really the heart of it. That's why these personal stories are so vital. They make these huge historical events feel real and personal. They give us those tiny details, like being afraid of a moonlit night, that numbers could never capture. And maybe most importantly, the act of writing it all down is itself a powerful statement. It's a way of saying, I was here, this happened. I think these simple drawings really capture the idea perfectly. In the middle of all the chaos, the war, the pandemic, you have this one single person, Lena, or Daniel, or Anne Frank, just one person with a pen and paper trying to make sense of it all. They are that single human voice in the crowd. Which kind of leaves us with a big question for our own time. We live in an age of information overload with constant updates and data everywhere. But hundreds of years from now, what personal stories, what diaries or blogs or social media threads will people look back on to understand what it really felt like to be alive today? Thanks for watching.